Hello, I'm Craig Camp. I'm General Manager of Troon Vineyard, and I want to welcome you to Troon Talk, our new regular video and audio podcast series to tell you the story of our project here at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We are a biodynamic and regenerative organic certified winery, and today we're going to discuss the 2021 vintage at Troon Vineyard with winemaker Nate Wall, who has transformed the wines here since his arrival in 2018. Nate has an exceptionally deep range of experiences and background before he came to Troon. So I think, Nate, that would be a great place to start and have you tell us a little about yourself.
Sure, yeah. So I came to Troon in 2018 after spending over a decade making wine in the Willamette Valley. That's definitely influenced my winemaking style and approach for sure. Before that, I actually did some winemaking in Virginia as well. So very different climate there. Previous to that, I earned a couple degrees and was working as an environmental engineer before I kind of recklessly threw that all away to embrace my passion of making wine. So, all of those experiences kind of leading me to Troon, with a science background, but also an appreciation of kind of, especially from the Willamette Valley, an appreciation of kind of the art and the subtlety of winemaking in the predominantly Pinot Noir region, and kind of how I see that influencing the decisions I make here at Troon.
And how would you generally describe the viticultural conditions in the Applegate Valley and what makes it a unique place?
Yeah, so first off, our soils, I always want to talk about the soils first, but, we're here surrounded by the Siskiyou Mountains, and the Siskiyous are pretty unique. They're quite old. Many of them are over 200 million years old, which by comparison, the Cascade Mountain Range, the volcanic range that, Mount Hood and Mount Shasta, things like that are a part of, those are 100,000 years old, or less. So, dramatically older mountain ranges here in the Siskiyous. And that also means that much older soils. So most of the Siskiyous are granitic. So the soils that we have here are decomposed granite. And as I said, they're older soils than most other parts of the state. So we have some of the oldest geology here of the state. Also, I guess then in terms of our climate, so we are in a Mediterranean climate, like much of the West Coast. That means most of our rainfall occurs only during the late fall through the spring, and then our growing season then is quite dry. That helps in many ways for us, particularly with our type of farming, with our organic and biodynamic regenerative agriculture type approaches. We have very low disease pressures in general here, not a lot of fungal issues, things like that, because of that dryness during our growing season. So that does really help us in a lot of our viticulture here as well. But I think, the interesting thing is when a lot of people think about Oregon, their first thought is the Willamette Valley, which is 3 hours north of us, and is a much, cooler and wetter growing region than we are down here in Southern Oregon in the Applegate Valley. So, what I'd like to say is that, we are a really warm, cool climate in the Applegate. And that aspect is really what I think you see in our wines, because in general, cool climate growing regions are known for their acidity. And in general, warmer climate regions, don't have that acidity, but have, greater ripeness, often showing themselves in, just larger, more structured wines. But we are smack dab in the middle of those two extremes. We are a warm enough climate to ripen these grapes like Grenache and Tannat, some of the white varieties, Vermentino, Marsanne Roussanne take a little bit more heat, Syrah can ripen here, certainly ripens great. It can also do well in cooler climates, but we have the heat to do that, but then we also have this great kind of cooling effect here where the mountains around us, the ocean influence, we are just 60 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So we can get a cooling influence from the ocean that kicks in around 3 o'clock or so in the afternoon. As the valley heats up, that warm air rises and it creates a vacuum that starts pulling in that cooler air from the ocean, and that cools us down and helps maintain that acidity. So we have acidity similar to a cool climate growing region, but then we have the heat that also allows us to ripen some of these warmer grape varieties. So we are like a warm, cool climate growing region here. And I think that's what makes the Applegate Valley very unique, and what really allows us to make the wines we do, which can have like an elegance and a finesse to them, like a balance, that I think is a real kind of calling card of the Applegate Valley.
So the Applegate Valley being located between the Willamette Valley in the north and the Northern California wine regions to the south, would you describe it as a transitional zone it's got some of the aspects of both?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, you do get, I think that the best of both worlds there. It's a very unique region. It's in terms of biological diversity, by the way, it is one of the most diverse ecoregions in America, because of these kind of converging. We get like the cooler, wetter, conditions from up north, but the warmer, drier conditions from down south, and they kind of converge right here, especially in the Applegate Valley. So we do get both the kind of the best of both of those worlds, as well as that gives a lot of the diversity that you see here. I mean, we don't have like a single grape that defines us in the same way that Pinot Noir does to the Willamette Valley, because there's so many, there's mountain ranges around here. There's a lot of different elevations. We haven't talked about elevation. Elevation is pretty important. Our valley floors are higher than the highest points of the Willamette Valley, for example. So, we're working with a lot of different elevations here. There's a lot of different, slopes and different aspects. And so, you can find a region to grow a lot of different grapes here really well. And that's a lot of what makes this growing region really exciting, is that we do have the ability, if the site selection is done well, to grow a lot of things really well.
Do you find vintages in Southern Oregon to be consistent or to vary significantly?
Well, there's the entire climate change discussion with, new normals and all of that. But I would say that we have found a little bit of a new normal these past, well, certainly since I've been here, but even before even before 2018, I've been working with fruit from Southern Oregon for 6-7 years before that. So I have been coming down to the area, bringing grapes back up north. And I would say that things are somewhat in a new normal. And it feels like while we do have some consistency in what to expect, certainly our ripening dates can vary, plus or minus a couple weeks, maybe at most, more like about a week or so different between vintage to vintage, but not like months. We're not seeing like a dramatic shift. But all that said, we do have a lot of variability, between vintage to vintage, which I take as a good thing. Our wines here reflect vintage variability, and that's I think an exciting aspect about our region. If we're going to talk about 2021 and specifically, I would say that we were having a pretty like new normal year up until early June. And then in early June of 2021, we had a heat event, which is not unusual in and of itself for our region. Like we do often have, areas of, we get times when it's 100, 105 degrees for several days in a row, but those normally happen in August, not in June. So we generally go through veraison, the color change of the grapes, where they stop, getting larger, they stop growing larger and they start focusing on ripening at veraison. That normally happens in August for us, different points for different grape varieties. But so this June heat event was before veraison. So what it did, at least we hypothesize it did, is that it kind of changed a little bit of how the grape was setting itself up for veraison. So what we noticed at harvest in 2021 is elevated malic acid levels. So there's tartaric acid and malic acid in wines, and malic acid is something that the grape can metabolize to help it deal with stressors such as heat. And likely because of that early heat event, we had more malic acid produced in the grapes. So that, and then interestingly enough, we did not have a similar really high heat event later in the year. So the grapes seemed to produce more malic acid that year, but then did not metabolize them to deal with other stressful conditions to the extent that they often do during the rest of the growing season. So what we saw is pretty high malic acid levels at harvest this year. And so that's going to feed into a couple different things. One, the wines of 2021 will have, really great acidity. They often do here, but in 2021 in particular, we saw elevated acidity at harvest. Interestingly enough, because it was malic acid, that means this acid is going to undergo the secondary fermentation, malolactic fermentation, and it'll be converted into lactic acid for most of the wines. And that is going to reduce naturally reduce some of that perception of acidity, but it'll also add a nice richness, particularly across the mid palate of the wine. So I expect, it's too early to tell on some things in particular. Our wines are still undergoing malolactic fermentation in much of the cellar. They're just finishing up. But not only will they have nice acidity, they also should have a good richness across the mid palate from that malolactic fermentation. So, my guess is, in general, we always shoot for balanced wines here, and this year should be no exception. With the added caveat is that I expect to see a little more richness in our wines this year from 2021.
How about the harvest itself? Did you feel it progressed at a normal pace? Were you more rushed than usual?
Well, what was really exciting for us is we started harvesting a couple new grape varieties at Troon. So, as you may know, we have been replanting a large portion of our vineyard each year. And in 2021, we got our first harvest of some of the newer Syrah clones that we had planted. But we also got the very first harvest of Mourvèdre, for example, on our site. It wasn't a large harvest. It was actually only second year. It had no business giving us grapes, but it was very happy and it gave us some grapes last year. So, I guess it's the interesting thing for me about 2021 is we're just starting to get the first, the first dribbles of this new fruit coming in that in 2022 we will receive full harvest from. So yeah, Mourvèdre, we had some Cinsault, some Counois, all got some small harvests of that in addition to the Syrah harvest, and we'll start getting the new Marsanne and Roussanne, and some more Vermentino next year, and perhaps probably some Carignan. We'll be doing some Grenache. will be ripening up as well. We did get some Grenache this year for the first time as well. So yeah, I think the harvest schedule pretty much went as planned, except that now we're starting to get new varieties come online. And what's pretty great about the varieties we have planted is they do have a very long ripening window. So generally we kind of move through that harvest window, and different grapes, some grapes are earlier season, some grapes are mid-season, and some grapes are later season. And it kind of lets us have a consistent harvest just, throughout, starting in, for rosé harvest, starting in early September, early to the, second week of September or so, and then going through, late October is our harvest window, and different grapes ripen up at different times. And it lets us pick those grapes without ever, kind of at our leisure, without ever getting like a flood of grapes coming into the winery at the same time. So, kind of consistent. And that's what 2021 was for the most part. It was, grapes coming in pretty consistently. The last grapes we generally harvest here are Tannat as one of the later ripening ones. This year we did, wonder about some frost, some fall frost conditions. And so that Tannat got pulled in, pretty much right as those frost conditions were happening. But in general, I think it was a pretty consistent harvest. Nothing was too rushed. We were able to get the fruit in when we wanted to. It was a harvest where we got to make almost all the picking decisions. Our hand wasn't forced by some weather event or something like that.
Now, you've been making biodynamic wines from biodynamically farmed grapes now for several years. What kind of impacts do you think you're seeing in the vineyard, especially from last vintage?
Yeah, so each year we farm biodynamically, and this is kind of the goal of regenerative farming. But the longer you farm in this way, the better the vines get, the better the land gets. You are improving the land through your farming, rather than extracting and basically making it less. You are actually, it's an additive process. You are regenerating that land, making it better. So we are seeing that certainly in the grapes and in the cellar and the fermentations. So through the years, as we continue to ferment with our indigenous yeasts in the winery, and then those grape skins and stems and seeds go into our compost pile. That compost is spread throughout the vineyard, kind of re-inoculates the vineyard with those native yeasts. And then the following year, when we bring the grapes in, they've had like an extra little inoculum of those yeasts in the vineyard. And we do it again, we ferment, we compost it, put it back out there. And what we're seeing is year after year, our native ferments, basically they get like happier every year. So they get, they seem to kick off a little faster. They just ferment some more smoothly. Part of the farming is also making our vines healthier. So it's actually the nutritional components of those vines. They have better intrinsic nutritional value. So the yeasts have more to work with. They are fermenting healthier with better nutrition. So those ferments are starting faster, going along smoother. And we're just seeing like that happen kind of a little bit more every year. And I attribute that completely to our farming, where as we are, making that virtuous cycle and returning those yeasts and added nutrients, through our compost program back to the vineyard, we're seeing that, pay dividends in the cellar year after year through these cleaner, healthier ferments.
So your first wines from 2021 will soon be going in the bottle. Can you comment on the first bottling coming up?
Yes. Well, like everything in the world nowadays, we are hit with, supply chain issues and shortages. So once we get the bottles, we will have wine go into them. So a little bit of a challenge just getting glass this year. But so far, so good. We've had some slight setbacks, but I think we are now scheduled and locked into this. But yeah, the first wines that will go into bottles are the rosé, Kubli Bench rosé, which this year is a blend of Tinta Ruriz and Malbec as a rosé. So that should be the Tinta Ruriz as a rosé component is interesting. It gives a really nice minerality to a rosé. Just kind of crisp, clean minerality. And then the Malbec, as you would expect, does lend a nice fruit character to that blend. So the Tinta Ruriz Malbec, components make a really nice, complementary pair to each other, giving the rosé some nice acidity, backbone, and structure, but also some fruit on there. And this year, I mentioned we did have a little bit of Counois ripen up for the first time on our property, and so the rosé also does have a little bit of that Counois fermented as rosé. So that'll be a fun one. We've got that going in. We've got the Glou Glou Grenache. The Glou Glou Grenache is our carbonic maceration Grenache. So that is a situation where we take the grapes from harvest. All of our harvest is done manually, which means that we do receive the entire grape cluster because it's manually snipped off the vine by human hands. And so we take that whole cluster, 100% whole cluster grapes, and put it into a stainless steel tank. We put some dry ice in there to try to get rid of all the oxygen, because we actually want an anaerobic environment for this to happen. We drop a lid on top, so it's in this totally closed stainless steel tank, and then we wait. And about 2 weeks later, we open that up, and there's been this conversion of the sugars into alcohol without having the grapes be crushed. So that conversion is actually happening inside the grape, which means that you're getting what's not a fermentation. It's actually a chemical, like enzymatic transition of the sugar into alcohol. That's occurring without contacting the skins. So once we do pop that open, we do foot tread it, and then the wine will finish its fermentation in a more traditional aerobic a yeast-driven fermentation. But that first 2 weeks of carbonic maceration gives it like a really fruity texture, really fruity flavors rather, and just minimal texture coming from the skin tannins, because it's not that process is occurring inside the grapes. So the Glou Glou Grenache then that will get bottled is just a really fun, it's like a Nouveau style wine that's meant to be consumed, pretty much after release. And it's fruity, and it can take a nice chill to it. This is one of those chillable reds where, on a summer day, you put this in the fridge for 15 minutes, take it out, and it's just, really delicious, to have. You don't have to overthink it. It's just a fun wine. So that one's getting bottled. Also, our Kubli Bench Amber, which is the amber wines are the skin fermented white wines. So that is where we treat what are generally white wine grapes. We treat them in a manner similar to making a red wine. So we ferment those wines in bins as entire grapes, and sometimes with whole clusters included as well. Those wines then are pressed off, barreled down, and through that fermentation process, you pick up the aromatics associated with white wines. You get those pretty floral aromatics, and some of the fruit associated with that. But then you also get texture from the skin contact. So you do get tannins, and you end up with kind of tea-like tannins to them. So you get some of the structure of a red wine with a lot of the floral and fruit characteristics of a white wine. So those are the amber wines. And this Kubli Bench Amber is a blend of skin fermented Riesling and Vermentino, as well as a little bit of Roussanne this year. We skin fermented some Roussanne for that. So that's another fun one we'll be bottling up. And the last wine we're bottling is the Estate Vermentino. So if I had to pick one grape that just loves growing at Troon more than any other, it is Vermentino. Every year during harvest, like that the grape chemistry of those ripening grapes is just perfect. It's, you're always dealing with, like, over time, acidity starts dropping and sugars start rising, and then like flavors start developing, and you're trying to like get to that point where like all those things come together in like that bullseye, and Vermentino hits that bullseye every single year. It just everything comes in perfectly, and so that grape just loves this climate, and it's one of my favorite wines that we make here, because it's just such a good reflection of our terroir, and it's clearly meant to grow in conditions like these. And so I'm always happy that we get to bottle this one up pretty soon in the season. Yeah.
Were there any particular lessons to be learned from the 2021 vintage that will impact our winemaking in the future?
Yeah, well, the biggest lessons we're starting to learn is how these new grapes that we have planted, how they ripen, and we're starting to learn what to expect from them. So being able to see what does Mourvèdre do at our site, how is Grenache doing for us, the Cinsault and the Counois, and getting these new grapes is really the lessons we're going to take. And like I said, we only got, as like a first harvest, or, in some cases not even, shouldn't even have been a first harvest if they were only second year grapes. But we're starting to just get some of that into the winery and kind of expect, or starting to learn what to expect from these grapes. And that will guide our thinking, certainly in 2022 here, about, what styles of wine those want to be. Some of them will be used for our rosé program. So we kind of got to taste some of these grapes this year as they were ripening, and we can tell certain part of our site. I think, these red grapes are actually going to want to be rosé. So next year's Kubli Bench Amber, we no longer have Tintoreries, planted. We do have Malbec still, but a less Malbec planted. So that Malbec will end up being used for red. And so next year's Kubli Bench Rosé will be some cool combination of a lot of these new grapes that we have growing, and Mourvèdre and Cinsault and Grenache. Those can all make great red wines and amazing rosés. And so we're starting to learn that from 2021, which direction we think some of those grapes may want to go. Like, how can they best express themselves? Do they want to be a rosé, or do they want to be a red wine? And as 2022 will tell us a lot more about that process. And so that's really exciting to be able to, it's been a long process of replanting some of these grapes, and it takes 3 years generally to start getting a crop of harvestable grapes for wine. So developing a vineyard is a very slow motion process, and it's really exciting to literally start seeing these come to fruition.
It seems a good day to talk, kind of review the 2021 vintage as we're starting. It's our first day of pruning as we head into 2022. Any just final thoughts on 2021 before we move on to the next vintage?
Yeah, well, 2021. I mean, it's you'll start seeing some of these white and the amber and the Glou Grenache wines. We're starting to bottle those. It's going to take a while for you to see the red wines. Our red wines, we over vintage many of them. So the wines that we're going to be bottling, this year are the 2020s. And so it'll be 2023 before you start seeing some of these 2021 red wines come out. So that gives us some time to have them, sit in our cellar. And the barrel aging process, we use all neutral oak. We don't have any new oak here. So the barrel aging process for us is not so much about extracting additional oak components in the wine, but just give that wine time to age, for those tannins to develop, for the wine to really integrate before we put it into bottle. And so that's a process that'll be going on with the 2021s now for another year and a half before they go into bottle. But I'm really excited about 2021 wines. I think it was a great harvest. It was, like I said, the wines have some interesting characteristics with the fact that we had that elevated acidity. So I think that, we always go for balance here. I generally make picking decisions based on the pH of a wine, so rather than the sugar. So you can look at a lot of different components of a ripening berry, but to me, the most important one is the acidity, the pH of a wine, and the TA, the titratable acidity, because picking based upon that always leads you to a balanced wine. In some years, there may be higher alcohol, some years may be lower alcohol. Some of the flavor components of the fruit may change based on that vintage. And it will reflect vintage variation that way. If you have the acidity, though, you're always going to have a balanced wine. And so I think the 2021s will be really interesting balanced wines that do have this kind of fullness and richness to them that I think will be pretty exciting.
Well, we're all excited to taste them. Everybody here at the winery can't wait to get these wines out into the market and share them with everyone. Thanks so much for your time, Nate. It was an exciting vintage, and looking forward to 2022.
That's right.